And we are live.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the heck in the world you are. It's the one, the only V, the Gorilla Economist, coming to you live with my main man, London Paul, because it is time for the Sirius report. So for all of you that are out there, aloha snack bar and out salami bacon, and all that other good stuff. Without further ado, Paul, what's going on, man?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. I mean, you guys. It seems like every week there's some sort of an attack by the religion of peace, or the religion of pieces, in your country, man.
Yeah, well, I think I'll park the London thing
Mm-hmm.
initially, but I think we'll talk quite a bit about what's gone on in Qatar. And I know you
Yeah,
mentioned it this
there's
morning
bigger
in the
stuff
show.
going on in the world. You're right about
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
but so we might have a bit of cross-pollination from what you said earlier. But what I will say to everybody is particularly on the podcast with our subscribers, I've spoken a lot about the disintegration of the GCC, the Gulf
Yeah.
Cooperation Council, being on the cards. And what we've seen with Qatar is a massive stride in that direction. I mean, to put it in context, obviously the UAE, Saudi, Egypt, and Bahrain, and also Yemen now, have severed all diplomatic relations with Qatar. Now, what's interesting is, probably not known by a lot of people, is this happened where they withdrew diplomats in 2014, but not to sever all diplomatic relations, and they've also expelled Qatar from the Yemen war. Now, severing diplomatic ties is very rare and is a pretty extreme step in that part of the world. But the rationale provided is that they said the fact that Qatar nurtures special relationships with Muslim Brotherhood groups and splinter groups, and eventually with other terror groups they don't define, to serve its own agenda, meant that it's not aligning its position of those of the fellow Gulf Cooperation Council members. Well, we obviously know this is absolute nonsense because everybody knows Saudi's the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world. But
Right.
so therefore, it's just an excuse. They've known about this Muslim Brotherhood connection for since 2011. So this is hardly news, but it's suddenly become an issue. So we know full well it's just an excuse to marginalise them. So what happened? Well, obviously Saudi and Bahrain banned all travel of its citizens to Qatar, and UAE, Saudi and Bahrain have shut all the ports, including sea and land, to Qatar. So they're effectively just trying to isolate them in totality. And Qataris have been expelled from the UAE, and they've all got to leave in 2 weeks, and diplomats in 48 hours. So it's pretty hurried. And then I guess you're going to see retaliation soon. So anyone who's got a business in Doha, who lives in the GCC or does business with them, your business is going to be toast. The other problems I expect you can have huge banking issues and travel to be shut down to and from Qatar in the GCC as well. And then all these flights are being suspended from UAE to Qatar, and that's the Emirates, Etihad, and Fly Dubai.
Right.
Now, the issue is, so in a sense, they're completely or trying to blockade them in every respect with regards to the GCC nation. Now, the issue for me is, and where it gets interesting, you've got the largest US military base in the Middle East is in Qatar. Now, that effectively means if this carries on, that the air and naval activity is going to be curtailed to a large extent. And we can talk about the US, but the US has largely thus far not said much about this. They've kept pretty quiet and not got involved. Now, the other thing you're going to have the problems is that you're going to have food, truck and ships will not be able to bring any food or goods to Qatar by Saudi and UAE ports or land route. So how long is it going to be before they run out of those essential supplies? Now, Qatari Airways flights uses Saudi airspace to go to Europe, so they're going to have to take longer routes and go all around the world to be able to get to Europe in that regard. Now, and all airborne flights out of Qatar mostly use UAE airports, so that's in jeopardy, and they're going to have to be rerouted and cancelled. So it's going to cause a major problem.
Sure.
Now, the one thing that's interesting with the Qataris is you've got India, Japan, and South Korea. They're major trading partners of Qatar.
Right. Especially for LNG.
Yeah. So you've got gas and oil supplies are going to be impacted. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I mentioned this to CJ just before it came on. There are sources in both Egypt and Saudi Arabia are saying that an invasion of Qatar is imminent.
Huh. Wow.
So Obviously, this is going to raise a number of massive questions, which we'll discuss in due course. There's also reports of fighting on the border between Saudi and Qatar with gunfire and planes have been heard and seen.
This is crazy because America's largest naval base in the Middle East is in Qatar.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So now, of course, we can go back some of the backstory, but Turkey's pledged to help Qatar militarily if it's threatened by external entities. Now, so it's understood, obviously, that if Saudi's planning to invade Qatar with Egyptian assistance. Now, the Qataris apparently under this agreement, have asked Turkey and Iran for protection. Immediately, you see this situation where, on the one hand, you have Saudi and Egypt, and now Egypt will have only got involved because of this ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, because we always know that there was a coup and they got the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and then they got overthrown, and normality was, well, inverted commas, was restored in Egypt. So this is what Egypt's beef is with Qatar. That's how the Saudis have stoked this up. But if we were to have a military conflict where Egypt and Saudi are effectively trying to invade Qatar, and then you've got the Turks and the Iranians fighting on the other hand, then that creates huge problems for obvious reasons. Now,
Sure.
In reality, an Arab war is not going to be a long-lived affair, because the GCC can't sustain a war without a help, and I don't think for 1 minute Trump or the Russians or anyone else is going to put it with that. The US just doesn't want to really get involved, I don't think. And Russia, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, as we all know, just want to return to normal business in the region, albeit without the US dollar. So the issue is the GCC is now on this collision course of self-destruction, because undoubtedly, I think there's a new oil pipeline regime is going to be installed in the Middle East by Russia, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And those trillions of US treasuries in the GCC funds are going to become largely worthless when everything unfolds with the dollar. So you're beginning to see really the end of the GCC as it exists now. The interesting thing historically with regards to Qatar and Turkey is, and I know you touched on this earlier, but we'll go through it anyway, just for the context. Obviously, back in December 2015, yes, Turkey announced it had planned to establish a military base in Qatar. Right. But in reality, the plan was to form this major strategic alliance. But let's put this in context. Yeah. Turkey was a very different world back in then, because this was pre the Erdogan coup to get rid of him. This was when Russia was the sworn enemy, and they weren't particularly keen on China, and they're very much in the cabal, deep state, Washington stronghold that Turkey was at that point. Now, of course, Turkey, wants this military presence in the Gulf. There's no doubt about that, and they, the details of what this Qatari-Turkish alliance was largely unknown, but obviously the idea was that Turkey would be there to assist Qatar in the event of maybe an invasion or something happening. But so if he wants to protect Qatar from external threats, then if that agreement's been signed, then what happens if Saudi and Egypt or Saudi decides to invade Qatar? Well, Turkey immediately gets involved. But these Turkey-Qatar defense and military agreements go back a lot further. I think it was 10 years ago they signed a defense cooperation agreement, and probably 5 years ago some military training agreement. But anyway, in March 2015, the Turkish government parliament passed this military cooperation agreement between Turkey and Qatar. Now, where it gets interesting is that there was hints given just prior to the coup the wrong year. In July 2015, the Qatari Emir gave some hints that there'd be, thousands of Turkish troops stationed in Qatar, and they'd have special forces based there. Now, what's interesting is, ironically, and maybe because Turkey was in a very different world to where it is now, and obviously subsequently Qatar is now, but Riyadh at the time welcomed this alliance between Qatar and Turkey, principally because they thought, well, it counters Iran's growing regional influence. Because obviously, if you've got Turkey's military presence in the Gulf, and then you've got the United States at the Al Udeid, I think it is, base in Qatar. You've got the French naval base in Abu Dhabi, and the US and British naval bases in Bahrain. it adds some extra protection because they've always had this fear of Iran. Well, of course, at that time, they would have been welcoming because Turkey was in a very different place to where it is now, and so was Qatar. But however, there was some disagreement with amongst the GCC nations because they were fearful this Turkish-Qatari ties could reverse fortunes of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. Well, that's not come to pass in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, there's still a problem to some extent in Egypt, but not compared to what it was originally, obviously, when they took control in Egypt. So at the point at the back end of 2015, there was all these meetings that were going on between Doha and Ankara regarding this military alliance, and then obviously within Turkey there was some question marks as to what is the extent of this deal, because no one really actually knew what it was. I mean, was the Turkish base under Qatari control? Who's paying for the bills? And what's the legal foundation and political legitimacy of having Ankara in the region? So overall, very difficult to understand precisely what that deal was, but certainly Qatar has been accused, and Turkey, for meddling in Egypt about this, the Arab winter, as I refer to it, not Arab Spring, because they supported the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
And then Qatar created all these border issues between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, and there was a lot of, fortunately, quite heavy casualties as a result of it.
But isn't Qatar a deep state lackey? And that's the power play I'm still trying to understand, Paul.
Right. Yes. Yeah. At one time, most certainly it was. It was definitely a very deep state, and not just Washington deep state, but UK deep state, no doubt. There was a lot of CIA, MI6, and other agencies pulling the strings in Qatar. There's no doubt about it. But what we do know is very recently, Qatar has flipped to Iran and is now suddenly becoming far more in bed with the Iranians. And this is why I think, in part, that there are other reasons why Qatar is now.
Paul, you nailed it. Paul, you nailed it. It's we know about Iran, and we know about. I think you talked about this years ago. I wrote about it. Jim Willis talked about it. The Iran, India, Turkey workaround, where the trifecta were trading for Iranian natural gas and settling in gold. And now,
yes, I mean that's
So now Qatar going into that thing that is really changing the landscape here.
Well, it is, and the thing is, of course, is that the other thing Qatar's done recently, it's encouraged the Houthis to strengthen ties with Iran. That's another sign of some indication of a change. It's opened the Qatari market for Iranian investments, and Qatar. Sounds incredible, but Qatar was involved in this redistribution or distribution of maps to the Yemeni Houthi tribe, showing new borders of Yemen, which included regions that they were saying on the basis, well, this is going to be part of Yemen, which was Azir, which is just over the border from Yemen, and Taif, I think it's pronounced, which is just east of Mecca, smack in the middle of Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's very inflammatory what they were doing, and the thing, of course, is with Turkey. I mean, they kind of tolerated them more in the past because they were perceived, as we say, to provide this additional line of defense against Iran. Because obviously the whole kind of nuclear agreement meant that there was this fear, well, Tehran's going to come out from the cold, which they have done with the West. But as we say, this huge fly in the soup from the US perspective is that this base in Qatar, and it's the major role or the major player basically for the US presence in the Middle East. From what I understand, obviously it's the largest US base. It's got approximately 10,000 troops. It's actually located close to Doha. And for getting on for nearly a decade, it's been the headquarters of CENTCOM, covering 20 countries in the region. So strategically, it's a hugely important base. But ironically, of course, as much as the Saudis approved this relationship between Turkey and Qatar, the US approved it at the same time as well, because Turkey was still playing ball. And I suppose it's not really in any small part because of the Incirlik base, which is a base in Turkey, which was strategically important for the US, as well as the Al Udeid, I think, base as it's called in the US.
Yeah.
now we also have the issues of arms deals with Qatar. It just gets so convoluted because the US and the UK are big suppliers to those nations and the regions in general. I think they account for about 75%, sorry, of arms sales through the GCC. So this adds a further complexity because on the one hand, you've got the US selling arms to the Saudis, who may end up fighting a war with the Qataris, who are being sold arms by the US. I mean, how utterly ridiculous does it have to get? So that's another big problem. Now the US, obviously, there's an angle playing out here because we know recently Trump had that visit to the Saudi capital in Riyadh, and it was this idea of getting all these nations in the GCC to form this leadership behind Saudi that they thought they could help lead fellow Sunni Arab nations in this fight against extremism in inverted commas, and with Israel present a united front against the Shiite-led Iran. Well, that's failed and is not going to succeed. Now,
Right.
apparently Tillerson is coming out saying he wants to broker the impasse because it's really important that the GCC remains unified. Yeah, unified because they want to implement these this coalition fight against Iran and supposedly terrorist groups in the Middle East. But now, of course, the issue is that the US is, of course, treading this fine line and doesn't want to get involved. But it realizes that this coalition that's proposing via Saudi, and undoubtedly the Israelis want this coalition as well because they're desperate to see this fight against Iran succeed. That is in tatters because when the GCC falls apart, I mean, how long is it going to be? Not just you've got, if you look, okay, you've got Oman who isn't part of it, but they're firmly in bed with the Iranians. You've got Yemen. Well, okay, Yemen's split down the middle, but part of Yemen is very firmly in the camp of Iran. You've got Qatar now, who also is. So who's the Saudis going to rely on? Bahrain. You've got Egypt, the UAE, but perversely, the UAE it's incredulous because the UAE have been fighting the Saudis in Yemen. It's absolutely incredulous. The UAE took control of an airport from Saudi fighters in the UAE in Yemen. So this shows how ridiculous they've got this united front on the one hand, yet they're fighting each other in Yemen. So it's absolutely preposterous what's going on. And then we have to factor in the Iranians into the equation who've come out and said, you know, cutting diplomatic ties and isolating Qatar is not going to help the region solve its problems. I mean, as it basically rightly says, all this idea of sanctions and cutting diplomatic relations and closing borders and having this siege mentality are not solutions to the problems in the Middle East. And they've effectively said, look, all you GCC nations, you've got no choice. If you're going to have to adopt a democracy inside your borders and to pursue dialogue in the region. Now, people say, well, this is extremely hypocritical of the Iranians to come out with these comments because Iran's not a democracy, blah, blah, blah. Well, actually, Iran's not what most people think it is. It's far from perfect, but it's not like Saudi Arabia, for example, or other nations. So the Iranians obviously want to cool the waters as well because they don't want to get sucked into a war inside Qatar for obvious reasons. If there has to be a war, though, they'll most certainly fight it. But the issue is, and the other GCC nations should realize that if Iran goes to war, they will destroy every GCC nation in the process.
Right.
And that there is no doubt. Because the plan ultimately is, and even the US are behind this. The plan is to completely redraw the Middle East in terms of to remove the dictatorships and put in democratic governments. It sounds incredulous that this is possible to happen, but that has been the plan, to my knowledge, for several years. And the US is now at a point where it knows that's exactly what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to ultimately end up seeing, and this does sound incredulous, and people will say, I can't believe this is possible. But in the end, you are likely to see the US and Iranian forces working together to maintain a form of peace within the Middle East. They will actually be the two nations that will in effect put military forces in nations when all these, the House of Saud collapses. You can't just leave Saudi Arabia because it will just fall into the hands of extremists and become a far bigger problem than Saudi Arabia is now. So there has to be some way of brokering way of saying, okay, well, if these extreme kind of nations, or sorry, the extreme kind of people running these nations, such as the House of Saud, if you're going to get rid of them or they're going to disappear, and inevitably the House of Saud will collapse, you've got to have something in place. Otherwise, you're just going to have I mean, it'll be like Syria on steroids times 6 or 7 nations. It's going to be absolutely horrendous. So I think ultimately you will see, and I don't think the US will have much say other than they will have to cooperate, and they will cooperate with the Iranians. And I think ultimately that's the end goal. So what we're seeing here, in a sense, is the beginning of the breakup of the GCC. If war can be avoided at all costs, then of course, absolutely, that should be the case. So let's look at some of what can we say? Well, we know for a fact the OPEC deal's in tatters. No nations agree. They're all saying we're cutting supplies, and they're not cutting supply. Now, we're seeing a complete breakdown through, and Qatar's a great example, as you've said, with the deep state. That whole mechanism's breaking down and collapsing in the Middle East. Syria is another example of that. What's going on in Iraq's another example. Is Qatar joining the Eastern Alliance? Well, that remains to be seen, but certainly they're brokering better relations with the Iranians and the Russians as one example. But I'll throw an angle in about China in a minute in that regard. But only recently, the UAE Minister of State for Foreign Affairs has said that the GCC was facing a major crisis because Qatar was opening up to Iran, and absolutely they are. Now, has Russia promised Qatar access to a future pipeline? You know, we always had this story where the reason they wanted to get rid of Assad was because they wanted to put a pipeline from Qatar through Saudi Arabia, through Syria. Well, we know geographically you could run a pipeline from Qatar to Iran, to Iraq and Syria that way to Europe. Is that part of the deal? Is that why there's so much consternation and this idea of isolating Qatar? Because words got out that's going to be the future plan, which would completely destroy the whole basis of trying to foment any war in Syria, because that was the whole angle. It was all about this pipeline. Now, the death of the Syrian gas pipeline, what people will argue, was notionally the case anyway, and yes, absolutely it was. Notice Russia at the moment said nothing with regards to what's going on in Qatar. They're just keeping counsel, but it is entirely possible that the Saudis have done what they do now as well, because they want to drag Iran into a major war in the Middle East. And it's another Saudi attempt to foment this alliance against Iran, because other attempts have failed spectacularly. No one's interested in this. Yeah, the GCC have signed this cooperation agreement with the US as well, but that's kind of fallen by the wayside. No one's that interested. Of course, if Turkey ends up defending Qatar, they're finished in NATO. It's the end. You know, their angle in terms of NATO's is dead and buried. And then, of course, you're absolutely right. And we've got the LNG angle. Now, what's interesting is Japan's, there's a Japanese company called JERA, and they're the world's biggest buyer of liquefied natural gas. And, of course, they buy it from Qatar gas. Now, the Qataris are saying, look, there's not going to be any impact on the LNG supplies. But as we know, Qatar's the world's biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas, and Japan is the largest importer because it takes in about 1/3 of global shipments. Well, that's important. That relationship is maintained. Now, interesting, and this may be another angle why there's been all these threats made and to try and isolate Qatar. Qatar had this self-imposed ban on development of the world's biggest natural gas field. And then suddenly, in April of this year, they announced they were lifting that. Now, the interesting thing about this North Dome field, it has shares in this. You know, effectively, it's a split between Qatar and Iran. So Iran has a huge stake in this enormous gas field. Now, Iran has, severe domestic gas shortages. Now, but it also made a rapid increase in production from the South Pars as a top priority, and it signed a deal with Total in France back in November last year to develop this field. So, here's the point at the moment. Qatar's the biggest LNG, but Iran believes that it will exceed Qatar's output within 9 months. So
totally.
What you have is you have Qatar and Iran basically having a total control over liquid natural gas. Now, people immediately said, "Oh well, the reason Qatar's lifting the moratorium on this was because Iran plans to develop, the South Pars field." And they said, "No, no, we're working with Iran in cooperation to develop this field in Qatar." Now we know the Qatari economy suffered because of the global oil slump, yeah, but this would be a serious boost to its economy. So if we look at it as another angle, what I think is probably happening is Qatar's come to this agreement with Iran to share this offshore gas reserve through the North Dome field and South Pars in Iran. But here's the point: where's this going to? Well, we know Japan's getting it, so who's going to take up all the slack as well? Undoubtedly, it's not going to be Russia. It's going to be India and China.
Yeah.
They're the major market. So you're seeing this huge stranglehold being taken by the Qataris and the Iranians in terms of, well, for the Iranians having the supply themselves, and also in the process, India and China being, taking hold of this market. You're going to see the abandonment of this Syrian gas supply via the extension that was previously planned by the deep state cabal. So effectively, Qatar and Iran producing out of the same massive offshore reserve in the Persian Gulf, and they're just taking a stranglehold in the liquid natural gas market. I mean, that's another compelling reason why they want to isolate Qatar. I suspect there'll probably be moves to try and isolate it, and then probably remove the emir out of Qatar and try and put in what they believe is a more Western sympathetic emir in there to try and reinstate the original plan for this Syrian gas pipeline, even though it's failed and it's not going to happen. But they're still deluded and believe that's a possibility. So that's a clear angle in terms of where we're going. So it's a multifaceted approach. It's all largely because Qatar has turned east. It's turned towards Iran, and it's a perfect relationship because if you know your geography, Iran is literally no distance away from Qatar. So you can quite easily put the pipeline through across the sea, then you can just run it all the way up through Iran, into Iraq, through Syria, connect up, and you connect up to Europe, and you can have a control. And Qatar does very nicely out of it. And the one thing, of course, is because it doesn't go through Saudi Arabia, there's no way of controlling it. If anyone tried to take control of it, they can't because it goes through Iraq and Iran. And the issue is, people say, well, obviously at this juncture, Iraq's still very much unstable. Well, yes, it is. But this gas pipeline's not going to come about for years to come. So it's not an issue at the moment. By the time it becomes an issue, it's going through a stable environment and bypassing the Saudis. Well, the Saudis are not going to be too happy about that for obvious reasons. And then we look at Saudi's position with oil, and we've talked about this many times before. Their oil reserves are dwindling. They're pumping a lot of water. Saudis' economic, and I did something for people on the podcast, went through the sort of economic breakdown, which shows just how weak Saudi is. And I won't go into masses of detail because we probably don't have time to do that. But it's another example of how Saudi's are collapsing, and it's desperately trying to form an alliance now because it obviously, it's like anything. Why do you get rid of Gaddafi after 40 years? Why do you try to remove? Why are you suddenly deciding that Qatar's a problem when they've known about the Muslim Brotherhood for years? It's because the Qataris are moving away from the influence of the West. They're actually posing a serious threat to the Saudis as a result of it. Yeah. And that's primarily one of the reasons, but also because we say from the outset, Iran or Qatar's rotating towards Iran. There's been a lot of secret negotiations and talks going on. Now, if the Saudis do decide to actually have a proper military conflict, which I wouldn't say is definite, but it's a possibility, then you will see the Turkish and the Iranians get involved. The Saudis will be massacred pretty quickly. And the other stupidity is, haven't they learned their lesson? They're getting massacred by fighting a war in Yemen, and then they're going to seriously suggest fighting a war on two fronts. It's preposterous. They don't have the resources, they don't have the capability, and I cannot, for the life of me, believe for 1 minute that the US is going to go to the Saudis. Yeah, we'll back you and fight a war against Qatar, but bear in mind our biggest military base in the Middle East is in Qatar.
Right, exactly.
I mean, it's just, It's just not going to happen. So
No.
I think it's out of desperation. I mean, there's a fair chance that somewhere along the line, the Israelis are involved in the process of trying to stoke tensions. They're desperate to have an excuse to go to war with Iran. It's not going to happen. And the Iranians just get stronger and stronger in the Middle East. I mean, they've got the alliance again with Iraq. They've sorted those. They've got the alliance with Syria. They've got the alliance with Oman. They're starting to become a dominant player. And I wrote an article and talked about this last year. You're seeing the rebirth of Persia, and Persia is an old culture that will thrive and become strong again in the region. And of course, the consequence of that is the UAE in places like that risk becoming, has been, nations, because they only came about through effectively the subjugation of Iran, and that's how all the smaller emirates came about and started to become strong. They're likely to suffer as Iran becomes, a strong dominant in inverted commas, not dominant in a kind of Western dominant way. And undoubtedly, I think this is the point we're at, and I think it's another example of the sheer desperation. And it probably should come as no surprise that this has come on the back of amazing changes of fortune going on in Iraq and Syria with ISIS, Daesh, or whoever else they're fighting. It's another example of the weakening. When they start to weaken and lose the initiative in one, they'll try and shift the focus somewhere else, thinking that they can somehow gain some traction elsewhere. But it's simply not going to happen. And it's precisely another reason why they've turned their attention to the Philippines, because they desperately realize that the grip the Washington deep state had on the Philippines is gone. So hence why there's suddenly this increase in tensions. And we've got splinters of Daesh or ISIS or whoever it is fighting in the Philippines. It's precisely that reason. They're just trying to shift the focus point, but they're trying to, it's like, they're just trying to plug too many holes in the dike or the dam, and they just simply can't do this anymore. And if they do seriously start to have a military conflict, the Saudis, there's only one nation that's going to lose, and the Saudis will lose spectacularly. But they're just not obviously thinking particularly clearly in terms of what the strategy they're trying to apply, because the GCC, the only way the US will support is the GCC being unified. Well, it's not. And how long is the likes of Bahrain and the UAE going to stand there and defend the Saudis? I don't think it'll be particularly long. And Egypt certainly has huge influence in terms of Russia now, both militarily and economically. And I'm pretty sure at some point, Lavrov or someone's going to get on the phone to Cairo and say, look, you need to understand what's going on. Yeah, there is undoubtedly issues with Qatar in the past, but you need to understand the reality of what was going on with Qatar. And you need to understand the future and the position of where Qatar's going, or seems to be going. And very quickly, Saudi Arabia is going to end up probably isolated totally on a world stage. And then the situation comes about is, how long does the House of Saud survive? Well, it's been without US support, and whatever we say about them selling a whole bunch of arms to the Saudi, Trump doesn't give the support that Saudi had in the Bush days, and probably to a lesser extent during the Obama days, but certainly was still there. That's gone away. So they're going to be stood there isolated and not know what to do, and therefore that also will play into the hands that the Saudis are sat there going, well, who are we going to work with? Washington's walked away from us, and they're naturally then probably likely to want to rotate east towards the Russians and the Chinese. And we come back to that old favorite subject with the Saudis of, all contracts denominated in yuan. Those discussions are ongoing. It's very likely to happen at some point, but that will cause the implosion and death of the petrodollar. But in the process, if the GCC collapses, you're going to see, because all these nations peg their currency to the dollar, when the peg goes to the dollar, then the GCC nations will collapse, and in the process, petrodollar is going to die one way or the other. And that's another example, probably why the fear is that that's precisely what's going to happen. And I think Iran's largely doing the bidding for others. I don't think it's particularly doing it because it benefits itself. I mean, it's cutting off its nose to spite its face, deciding to create this diplomatic spat with Qatar, and we'll see if anything does evolve militarily. But that seems to be the what I'm hearing is coming out of Egypt and Saudi in terms of some kind of military conflict imminently, but it will be an absolute disaster for Saudi. And in the process, while they're trying to fight a war on two fronts, it's only going to strengthen the Houthis and who'll make further encroachments into Saudi Arabia. And it's just, in the end, they're going to be, it's a bit like what Germany did in the war, that you try and fight a war on two fronts and you're going to lose. You've had it. And that's precisely what the Saudis are going to do. And instead of backing out of Yemen like they should do, they're now deciding to potentially start stoking a war with Qatar in the process. It's farcical, but I mean, diplomatically, what happens when Turkey gets involved?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it becomes a huge headache for NATO and beyond. So, it's an absolute A1 shitstorm that's brewing in terms of the Middle East. So, we talked for a long time about it, but in a very broad sense, and we could probably go into masses more of detail, but in a very broad sense, that's what this is all about. It's always the timing with these things. If they really had a beef with Qatar, they could have gone after them years ago. Well, they haven't, because the timing's all come about with Qatar rotating to Iran. This is why it's suddenly become a big hot potato for Saudi, because they see the writings on the wall for themselves, and deludedly they probably believe that the pipeline would still go through Saudi and into Syria, because they still probably believed that Assad was going to lose, which he's not. I mean, Syria is very much more stable than it was, and I wouldn't say the war's over, far from that, but we're a huge stride in the right direction from 12 months ago. The position's a lot stronger for the Assad government to will survive because of, obviously, and ironically, of course, Iranian, Turkish, and Russian support. So there you go. You've got the Turkey Iranian angle again that's working in Syria. Now it's likely to work in Qatar. So, and of course, there is some issues to do with what happens in terms of Kurdistan and the Kurds, but we know for a fact that Kurdistan's rotating in Iraq towards Russia as well. So there's a lot of those political hot potatoes in the Middle East that are slowly getting resolved. And I think if you factor in the economic dominance of China, I mean, what's Saudi Arabia going to do? It's going to turn to the Chinese and go, well, okay, we know you can help us out. Well, the first thing they're going to say is, well, you don't think you're going to impact our LNG supplies from Qatar, do you? If you want us to work with you, you're going to back off from that. Otherwise, no deal, and we'll let you sink. So the Chinese have a huge amount of economic leverage. The Russians, I don't think, will get involved in this, but process in terms of Qatar. But of course, they have the military presence and the diplomatic presence in the region to have a huge amount of influence. So as the US influence has waned, and it considerably has done so particularly in the last sort of year or so, but more so since Trump was elected, that has changed the whole dynamics in the Middle East. So in many senses, we're probably on the cusp of these massive changes that will come about in the Middle East. And the issue is, probably in the end, the Saudis will just have to hand over their oil fields probably to the Chinese, because that's the only way they're going to survive. I mean, and even then, arguably, they're not. Certainly, the House of Saud won't survive. But if Saudi has any future, it's going to have to compromise massively on its current stand. And then, of course, the question ultimately comes about, what does this all do to Israel in the process? Because they're largely completely isolated, and even though there's all this idea of Saudi and Israel don't particularly see eye to eye, and I think, of course, privately that's complete nonsense. So, but Israel becomes more and more isolated, and in the end, of course, there's huge diplomatic pressure becoming on Israel now. We've talked about the silent role of China, but even China have now said, well, actually, we may get involved in the diplomatic process in terms of a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. So you've got the Russians and the Chinese now putting huge pressure on the Israelis, and this is all part of this idea to change the complete map of the Middle East. So it's not just Europe that changes hugely, it's the Middle East, because we know it's been the cabal deep state playground for basically since the advent of the petrodollar.
It's massive, man. The changes that are occurring. What do you think? I mean, switching gears real quick from the Middle East and all the things that are changing over there. How is this? What's the situation in Europe, in the UK now with the latest round of terror attacks? Theresa May coming out saying that we need to, ban the internet and end cryptocurrencies and everything except ban immigration.
Okay, well let's discuss the Theresa May angle. Look, the reality is it's the 5th of June today. It's the 8th of June on Thursday is the day of the UK election. This is pure electioneering bullshit. There's no other word for it. I want to appeal to everyone that I'm strong on terrorism, and we're not, and the average person in the street's going to buy this rhetoric. They're going to buy the idea of the internet. But she was Home Secretary for years. She's made these comments about the internet. It's rubbish. It's never going to happen. It's absolute nonsense. It's the same with cryptocurrencies. It's not going to happen. It's just electioneering comments because 3 weeks ago they were 15 points ahead, 20 points ahead, and now apparently it's virtually neck and neck. Now, if Corbyn was to be elected,
the background for those that don't know politics, who exactly is Corbyn? What's his background?
Okay, Corbyn's the Labour. He's basically, there's two major parties in the UK. You've got the Conservatives, which is Theresa May, and you've got Corbyn, who's the Labour leader. Now, if Corbyn, I don't think it's likely to happen. We may end up with another coalition government, but if Corbyn was elected outright, it would be the biggest shock. It would make Brexit and Trump elected seem like just normal events in political history. It would be that big. It would send shockwaves through Europe that would terrify them because he's got a completely different stance on things. So this is desperation from May in terms of a reaction to what's happened. And May's come in for a lot of criticism, and because she's publicly was at odds with the police commission. It was saying only a year or two ago, look, we're severely understaffed. And it's true, the US police force is 20% smaller than it was when the Conservatives formed the coalition government in 2010 after 13 years of a Labour government. Sure. And they said, look, this is going to lead to problems. We can't police things properly. We're not able to resource things effectively. And she dismissed it, calling it fear mongering. Well, of course, every time we have a terrorist attack, this gets brought out in it, and our nose is rubbed in it. And ultimately, the irony is these attacks are very detrimental to the Conservative Party. They're not doing them any favours because more and more people are remembering comments about what Theresa May said and what this government's done in terms of reducing police force. Now, in terms of the actual event, well, obviously it was around 10 o'clock. This vehicle hit pedestrians. They said, 48 people were taken to 5 hospitals across London. 7 people have died. And then the van stopped in the vicinity of Borough Road. Now, I know around there extremely well. There's a lot of bars and pubs, etc. And then basically they got out, these 3 men got out with long blades and started just stabbing people at random in the Borough High Street. The 3 attackers were confronted and shot dead by police in a very short space of time. And they reckon that they were wearing suspected explosive vests, but they turned out to be hoaxes. Now, of course, immediately I'm going to get levied, and I got a lot of criticism and stick for saying this publicly and privately that I took. So once again, it is a real attack. People were killed, people were injured. It's not a hoax in that sense. Yes, it's a false flag attack, but there were casualties. People were injured and killed. Now, interestingly, people always say, well, I don't see the clips. Well, the police have asked people who'd recorded the incident to send their clips so they could be publicly put on the show so everyone could see them. There was things where police entered bars and told people to hit the floor because these attackers were inside bars, which apparently was the case. Now, and then of course, the question is, people go, well, why weren't people filming this? Well, I'll tell you what, if someone's running towards me with a 12-inch knife or whatever it was, threatening to stab me, I'm not going to stand there and go, well, could you just stand still a minute while I just take a little still of you for posterity? You're going to run like hell, and you're not going to stand there waiting to take a picture of them. And so this is another example. And you could argue there was a Russian, I think, physician who said he treated people. What is he part of some big elaborate plan as a hoax? And well, obviously not. And the list goes on. All these police officers and hospitals, they can't be all in on it. All the people in this Borough High Street, there's a lot of bars. It's very busy at the weekend. Well, all these people are in on it as well. We'll know. But here's where the problem is, and this is what's starting to really bite the government and the security services, is apparently the counter-terrorism officers had recorded this alleged terror cell that was in Barking, where they've subsequently made a dozen arrests. And apparently there was a plot being discussed that they recorded about a van a knife attack in London. Well, look what's happened in around London Bridge, so that's happened. And so the question then people are saying was, well, hang on, you apparently were investigating these people and never followed it up. So what the hell was going on? Now there'll be the arguments about resource issue and everything else. By all accounts, one of the people are saying had an Irish ID card in him, and the attacker apparently does live in Ireland. And he was not known by the Garda, who's the Irish police, but he lived in Dublin, and he was married to an EU citizen, and apparently the Garda are now going to cooperate with them. There was also talk, apparently, that one of the suspects was known to the intelligence services. Well, this keeps cropping up. And apparently he appeared in a TV documentary last year about British jihadists. I mean, why anyone would make a documentary about that and not actually say, well, hang on a minute, who are these people?
This guy was on a documentary about British
apparently
jihadists?
Yes.
Are you kidding me, man?
No, I'm not joking. And
oh my God,
a friend
literally writes itself, Paul. It literally writes itself.
And this is the point. This is why the whole narrative is falling apart, because every time these things happen, it's like with the Manchester attack. These people were known. What were you doing about it? Now, of course, the government's under a lot of pressure. Or okay, we don't really have a government, but forget that because we have the election this week. But to all intents and purposes, the Conservative government, as it was, is being held responsible for this. There's a lot of heat on the Metropolitan Police. There's a lot of heat on the security services, who are now conducting an internal review, trying to understand why the hell do these people keep slipping through the net. I mean, there was allegations about this person who was on this documentary that someone had reported him to an anti-terror hotline, and there's also allegations that the police were warned that this suspect was trying to radicalize children up to 2 years ago. I mean, it's just astonishing that this level of crass incompetence goes on. But this is what's starting to come out now. It comes back to the point. This one has started to fuel more and more people's anger, and of course, I can always come back to the point. Yes, this is a very serious problem that it needs to deal with, but the cabal's intention all the way along, and I know I've said it before, but I'll make the point again. They wanted to flood Europe with immigrants based on wars that they created in Libya and Syria and other places. They wanted to flood them so they could also flood them with jihadists in the process, then foment to try and stir up the people of Europe, who would then subsequently revolt, and we could end up with a civil war type situation. Now, here's the point. If people want to go down that route, and there's a lot of these keyboard warriors talking like this, here's the problem. If the cabal give you a spade, do not dig a big hole for yourself and climb in, because that is what they're going to do. Yes, it's a massive problem and it needs dealing with, but the last thing we need to see in Britain or Europe or anywhere else is a kind of civil war where everyone's all out to get anybody and each other, and it'll get very ugly, and these keyboard warriors are going to be the first people hiding under their bed, terrified of what's going to happen. Because that's, be careful what you wish for. Yes, it does a problem needs dealing with. And I think there are elements, certainly within the security services, once again, who are not doing the job they're supposed to be doing. I think the police are, I'm not a big fan of the police by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they're woefully understaffed and under-equipped. They're not be able to do their job properly. And there's going to come a point, and Theresa May says, well, enough's enough. But it's all hot air rhetoric. The point is, everybody knows ultimately what the problem is with all this, with terrorism. Everyone in the world who wants to think about it for 5 minutes realizes who's responsible for arming, training, and financing these people. And Saudi Arabia is one of the big problems, but they're not exclusively. Western nations have also been complicit in training people. I mean, we've had rogue elements in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The list goes on and on. Libya. I mean, every nation wherever there's been this conflict, the West's been sniffing around and being involved in it. That's where the problem is, and that's what the average person in the street still doesn't fully realize. But I think people are getting angry about it, but they need to be careful, and they need to direct their anger in terms of who needs to be held responsible and how they're going to deal with the problem. But as I say, the cabal give you a spade. Whatever you do, do not dig a hole for yourself, because that is exactly what they intend doing. And it was said to me 3 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, this is the plan. This is exactly what they intend to do. And the other problem is there's still about 6.5 million people who potentially could end up in Europe via Libya. That many refugees. Now, there are some legitimate refugees for sure, probably a fair percentage of them, but Europe's not capable of handling these, and they're certainly not capable of handling these people embedded within the refugee system, which clearly are not refugees at all, because they turn up and cause mayhem wherever they do. I mean, France is a great example of the problems that's been created there. And I've seen some horrendous footage of where they just demolished Paris, for example, and
Oh
of
my
course the
God.
Western media
Terrible.
doesn't. Yeah, but yeah, and I think talking about Paris, we really have to mention very briefly about the whole climate change deal and how Trump vetoes it.
Oh yes, yes. I was just about to ask you.
Yeah, I think we should briefly talk about that. Well, here's the point. We know he vetoes the deal, and we've said before many times that Trump takes the wrecking ball to the cabal. Well, let's face it, this is one of the biggest kill shots for these fake globalists, because the reality is we don't have globalization. It's a myth, but it's also a shot at the fake kind of climate change science that exists. And it does. Yes, the weather is undoubtedly changing. No one can dispute that, but it's not for the reasons we're given. So
Exactly.
why does Trump walk away from it? Well, pretty obvious. This whole Paris Accord undermines American jobs and competitiveness. I mean,
Correct.
if you look at Obama administration, what they effectively signed up to is that the US economy, it would cost them, I don't know, $4 trillion over the next 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years, something like that. And it's probably going to be a damn sight more than 4 trillion. It's probably 8 trillion. The US economy would lose millions of jobs. I mean, it can't afford to lose millions of jobs in an industrial sector that's suffering anyway. There's also the manufacturing sector, millions of jobs in that respect. It's going to destroy the coal industry, and that supplies, I understand, about a third of US electric power. It imposes completely ridiculous targets for carbon emissions on the US, while in effect also under the accord, China can actually increase its emissions for the next 15 years.
Right.
So no wonder China's not too particularly bothered about signing up to it. But I mean,
Right. And I
and
think India they get $2 billion a month or something like that, and they get to increase their emissions as well. So
yes,
on top
and
of
then of
getting paid.
course, yeah, and the agreement funds of this US climate fund that's underwritten effectively by American taxpayers, and Obama committed billions to this, which was about 30% of the initial funding without any authorization from Congress.
Right.
Now,
And then right.
which is absolutely farcical. I mean, the US has got 20 trillion in debt. It shouldn't be paying to subsidize other countries' energy needs. And of course, ultimately, we know this does absolutely nothing for the climate. I
Right.
mean, it's projected that these changes are likely, I mean, to reduce global temperatures in the next, well, 50, 100 years by a whopping 0.2 degrees.
Yep.
I mean, whereas in reality, if you look at like US shale gas development, that does more for the climate than any other agreement ever negotiated.
Right.
So it's all absolute rubbish. Yes, there is definitely issues with the climate, and Putin said as much. Yes, climate change is happening. There's no doubt, but there are plenty of other reasons why it's happening, and it's not. I mean, the whole climate change thing with the Paris Agreement's a farce, and it is a massive. It's a massive fu to the deep state by him taking the wrecking ball, because despite what Europe says and everyone else, if the US refuses to take part, in the end, the whole thing will collapse. But, it's not the first time that we've had these climate change deals fall and collapse. We had the Kyoto Agreement, where all these nations signed up, and eventually they all just went, well, no, we're not even going to adhere to it. We're not even going to pay any attention. It all collapsed. So they tried it again with this. And of course, people have said to me, well, Russia's signed up to. Yeah, but here's the point. Russia's not ratified it in its own parliament.
Right.
That's
Right.
that's hugely significant, and they won't ratify it because they'll say, "Well, hang on, this doesn't work. This doesn't work." It's another one of those TPP kind of TTIP hot air things. It sounds great in principle, but it's collapse, and it isn't. And in the long run, this is the death knell of it. So, if people still think Trump's controlled by the cabal, well, he's just taken the wrecking ball in a major way. And these are the kind of thing. Trump's role is to wreck the cabal in any way, shape, or form he can, and this is another example of doing that. And for
Absolutely.
sure, it's absolutely infuriating. That's why he walked away from the G7, and if looks could kill, Trump would have been a dead man because they're absolutely livid.
Yeah, there was a meme that
In
I saw. There was a meme that I saw where you see Macron and Merkel looking at Trump walking away, and the meme said, "The look you have when he who pays the tab leaves the restaurant."
yeah, exactly. And um, so yeah, this is just another a monumental shift, and it's the kind of thing that it happens, but you don't see the effects of it for a considerable period of time. But it is another applying the wrecking ball to it. And I think one thing is I'll mention very briefly about cryptocurrencies. It's funny, I kind of got leveled at me that I was a hater of them because I mentioned them. Then I got it leveled at me that I was this. Why am I turning into one of these people who's a pro cryptocurrency person? And so I can't win whatever I say. But I think what was interesting was what came out of comments that I'm always interested in what Russia and China have to say. And we had the St. Petersburg conference, which ran from the 1st to the 3rd of June. Now, it was in relative terms a great success, and I think it's largely displaced Davos, although Davos is rather like Bilderberg, a complete irrelevance, no matter what certain people may say. But the one thing that cropped up apparently repeatedly a lot in St. Petersburg was the word cryptocurrencies and blockchain. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, okay, what role can this emerging technology might play, say, for example, in the banking sector, which it has huge relevance. Now, we know Russia announced they're looking to develop a national cryptocurrency. That is a huge step. However, they acknowledge that few truly at this stage understand the real capability and potential of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Now, they've stated that they see huge interest they have in the current infrastructure technology, but they acknowledge from their perspective that it can't be implemented on a retail level. Now, I've had disagreements with people, and there are people swearing at me for suggesting that, but from my perspective, it's true at this stage. It doesn't mean it won't, I mean, eventually, we're going to have the immediate benefits now of blockchain technology, but that will trickle down to the retail level, which will increase, improvement and increase reliability on services. You're going to lower costs, have faster communication and transactions. Now, the question is, how long is that going to take? Now, the Russians, from what I understand, have said 5 years to fully unlock the potential of blockchain. And I tend to agree. I'm not necessarily saying it's 5 years, but it's very much like the situation in the early days of the internet. Everyone saw this, but never really saw the potential and the capability and what it could achieve. And there was a lot of early, days and the companies that came and went and disappeared. But in the end, whatever people think, and I'm not talking about investing in cryptocurrencies, I'll be straight and honest, I don't have any investment in them. And I never have done. That is
Right.
that is an absolute statement of fact. I'm not saying people should or shouldn't, it's up to them what they do. But I am a firm believer in blockchain. I think cryptocurrencies will have a future. It will most certainly reshape the financial sector. I think in the end, and not now, but at some point, banks will never be the same as they are now. Things will change out of all recognition, but this is years down the track. It's once again another one of those situations where everyone thinks you get rid of the cabal and everything changes in 5 minutes. It doesn't. It takes a number of years to bring these changes about, but
Right.
cryptocurrencies are here to stay. Blockchain has a huge future. It's probably one of the most incredible technologies that has come out in my lifetime in relative sense that
Yes.
I can remember. And I think it has huge applicability. But I'm interested when the Russians talk about it objectively and say, well, it is going to trickle down to retail and eventually it will become a significant player, but we're talking years off in the future. So
Sure.
I think because I'm a little bit concerned that people invest in cryptocurrencies and think all this is going to happen and I'm going to make huge amounts of money very quickly. Now, yes, Bitcoin has gone through the roof and continues to do so. Uh, but the issue is, how many of these cryptocurrencies that exist now are going to be around in 5 years' time? I
Right.
don't know. I don't have a crystal ball and I've got no way of knowing. But I doubt all of them will be. Some of them, but I think if the Russians introduce a national cryptocurrency, that's going to have massive sway in terms of its uptake and also the capability of what it's going to be used for. Do I think it's going to replace the ruble? No, I don't. I think it will be used initially. It can be used in terms of the banking sector. can be used in trade between nations. I think it will undoubtedly be gold-backed or some asset-backed, but probably gold-backed. That would give it huge applicability and huge credibility, and I think that's the direction we're going. So it is rather like the internet of the early days. I mean, certainly Bitcoin's been the trailblazer, and there's no disputing it, and it's brought a lot of attention to it, and it's underpinned by fantastic technology. But it's
Absolutely.
like everything. I'm more interested where we go in, and if I had a wonderful crystal ball, I'd love to be able to buy into a cryptocurrency that probably no one's interested in now, that you can buy for next to nothing, and in 5 years' time, it's going to be worth a fortune. But
Right.
I keep an open mind. I'm interested. I'm always looking at them, but it's your choice. Would people invest in what they want in? I would have laughed at people saying I'm going to continue to invest in the stock market. Well, they've made great returns, because I would never have believed it would have carried on as long as this. I thought, it just seemed impossible. But of course, we know what they've done subsequently while it's happened. So there's no right or wrong investment. So there's just people make a choice, and you pay your money and cut your cloth accordingly.
Yep, absolutely. Paul, we're down to actually we're a little over, but give out your closing comments and how people could get a hold of you, as well as your premium subscriber service.
Okay, well, closing thoughts. Well, let's just keep an eye on Qatar and the Middle East. That could
Yeah.
get very interesting. I think, like ever, just keep an eye on what Russia, China are doing. Keep an eye on what's going on in Europe. I mean, that's why the world's such a small place now. I know. I mean, in terms of the premium podcast, we cover off everything across the world. I try to get as much information and not neglect certain areas, but sometimes there's more things worth discussing in certain regions. But in a broad sense, we just try to cover off as much as possible. But I think just it's very hard to keep a focus on everything, because there is so much going on. But clearly, the developments with Qatar make it is actually in some ways takes the focus off a little bit on what's going on in Syria and Iraq currently. So I think that in a broad sense, the UK election, well, we'll see what happens. If Corbyn gets elected, my goodness, just watch what it does to the markets. It's going to be very, very interesting. Do I think he'll get elected? Probably not, but I've got no interest in party politics. It's all nonsense and an illusion. But I don't think it makes any difference. But it could have a huge ramifications if he does. So we'll see what comes out with regards to that. In terms of, we have the website, thesiriusreport.com. Got the Twitter page at the Sirius Report. The YouTube channel London Paul, and of course, as V rightly says, we have the podcast subscription service. It's $4.75 a month. You get 22 podcasts a month, roughly 10 to 15 minutes. It's very packed, very detailed. It's kind of a bit like what we've done today with Qatar, but you get that every day in some aspect of something. And what we discussed today, I wouldn't put in the podcast, and vice versa. So it's all information that's not divulged, and some of the stuff that we've talked about things, but publicly I haven't disclosed because people pay for it. So you have to, respect the fact that they do. And but we think it's very good value for money, and we'd like people to encourage them to subscribe, because we're not there to make a fortune out of it, but we're trying to make a decent amount of money, because the more that we can invest more and more time and effort in terms of what we research and how we go about things, because we want to provide an accurate picture of what's going on, rather like Rogue Money does and other people do, rather than the sensationalistic nonsense that comes out every week from people who are just interested in clickbait and not getting the truth and reality of what's happening. So, if I don't think $4.75 a month is a lot of money in the sense of what we do.
It's less than the price of a latte from Starbucks, Paul.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and we do, we put a lot of effort in. I take great pride in what I do. I don't want to put stuff. I mean, I don't just put information out there without making sure I can cross-reference it, that I get verification of it, and that it's actually factual information. And a lot of the things we've discussed in the podcast has subsequently come to pass and has happened in real time. And it's gone. I mean, I put the tweet out at the weekend saying, that the reason I did regarding the show today is because I had an inkling something was coming out of Qatar. We didn't know exactly, didn't have any real substance, but I got mutterings that something was coming out, and I thought by Monday, if it is, there's going to be some huge thing to talk about, and subsequently it's happened. So yes, I know I don't mention sources and people that we deal with, but I do deal with people. I have some excellent people I talk to, and believe it or not, we don't agree on things. We disagree on things. We have views, and we chew things over as well. I mean, some things are factual, and other things are opinion based. So we don't always agree. We've had disagreements in the past about uh, things that would happen with Iran and stuff like that. So, but it's a great soundboard. I have some great access to people and who I can talk to, and but also in the process, they don't tell me everything. I have to. A lot of times, you have to go out and work things out and understand things, and go back and say, "Look, this is what I understand is happening," and they'll go, "Yeah, okay, that's fine," or "No, you're completely wrong. You're barking up the wrong tree in that respect." So I do think it gives it added value, and of course, it's great when other people can verify things and talk about things publicly. And sometimes we don't talk about things, and then we will talk about it once other people are talking about it, because I don't want to always want the heat. I mean, people think it's great knowing things, but sometimes there's things I know I never discuss, because in the proverbial red dot starts following you around. This is why we're anonymous as well. We don't want people to know who we are, because there's things we discuss that we'd rather people didn't know who we were, and those people who want to be known have to take the consequences. But I'd rather just talk about things like we do on Rogue Money, and precisely why V doesn't want anyone to know who he is, because it's not about us. It's about getting the information out there for everyone to understand what's going on and the reality of it, and why it takes a long time for all these changes to come about.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. Folks, again, you can catch Paul at theseriusreport.com. Subscribe to his newsletter. It is his podcast is absolutely invaluable. It's your own presidential national security intelligence briefing on the daily basis. So check that out. And with that being said, we're all said and done. We'll be back again here next week as the world continues to accelerate with global events. Thank you so much all for listening in. CJ, take it away.